Hello, and welcome back to another session of Out of Context. Tonight, I will be reading from a book. As usual, of course. And, of course, as usual, I'm not going to tell you what it is until I finish reading. So, suppose we have to do my new ritual. I'm still milking this bottle, so we're going to keep going through it. And do our usual thing, a little bit of ice, just a teensy little bit of Jameson, just a little bit. Yeah, that seems good. Don't want to have too much alcohol, you know. Let's see here. Now after that, a little bit of ginger ale, because Jameson tastes awful. Just a ton of ginger ale. And, oh, it tastes great. Absolutely wonderful. I don't know why I do this. So, before I get started, I am going to do things just the teensiest bit differently this evening. Up until this point, I've been choosing one, chapter or section or what have you, and I've just been reading that, and whatever time we end up with, we end up with. However, a few of you seemed disappointed that last week it was so short when the previous week had been so long. And though I'm not entirely sure if that's because you like listening to the books or because you liked seeing me have to drink so much of this god-awful stuff, it doesn't really matter in the end, so we're gonna change it up. Instead, what I'll do is I'm gonna try and read for a certain period of time or pretty close to it. We'll make these a little bit longer. It's my favorite water. It's probably tap water? I'm not sure I really understand the question, but yeah, tap water sounds great. And again, we do have pretty good tap water here in Boston, so. Anyway, I think that's about enough of that. So I'm just going to get started. Of the original 140, could I be the last sentinel? The grim thought swirled through Dakel's mind. The invader's main force had overrun his country from the east 8 weeks earlier with brutal speed and cruelty. Cavalry and foot soldiers poured from the hills and swarmed into the valleys, razed the villages to the ground, and slaughtered all who stood before them. Along with the armies came elite bands of soldiers tasked with a single mission: locate the sacred Thurang, and bring it to their king. What testicle produces more sperm? Probably the right testicle. Along with the armies came elite bands of soldiers tasked with a single mission: locate the sacred Thurang and bring it to their king. Having foreseen this, the sentinels, whose duty was to protect the holy relic, removed it from its place of reverence and spirited it away. Dakel slowed his horse to a trot, slipped off the trail through a break in the trees, and stopped in a small shaded clearing. He climbed from the saddle, allowing his horse to wander to a nearby stream and bend its head to drink. He moved behind the horse to check the series of leather bands that had secured the cube-shaped chest to the animal's rump. As always, his cargo was held fast. The chest was a marvel, so solidly built that it could withstand a high fall onto a rock or repeated bludgeoning without showing the slightest crack. The locks were many, hidden and ingeniously designed to make them all but impossible to open. Of the 10 sentinels in Dakel's cadre, none had the resources or ability to open this unique chest, nor did any of them know whether its contents were genuine or a substitute. That honor, or perhaps curse, belonged solely to Dakel. How he had been chosen was not revealed to him, but he alone knew that this sacred chest carried the revered Thurang. Soon, with luck, he would find a safe place to hide it. For nearly the past 9 weeks, he'd been on the run, escaping the capital with his cadre just hours ahead of the invaders. For 2 days, as the smoke from their burning homes and fields filled the sky behind them, they raced south on horseback. If Harry Potter fought Spider-Man, would LeBron get his hair back? No, probably not. For nearly the past 9 weeks, he'd been on the run, escaping the capital for 2 days. On the third day, they split up, each sentinel heading in his predetermined direction, most heading away from the invaders' line of advance, but some back toward it. These brave men were either already dead or suffering at the hands of their enemy, who, having captured each sentinel's decoy cargo, was demanding to know how to gain access to his chest. As designed, this was an answer none of them could give. As for Dockel, his orders had taken him due east into the rising sun, a direction he'd maintained for the past 61 days. The land in which he now found himself was very different from the arid, mountainous terrain in which he was raised. Here, there were mountains too, but they were covered in thick forest and separated by lake-pocked valleys. It made staying hidden much easier, but it also had slowed his progress. The terrain was a double-edged sword. Skilled ambushers could be upon him before he had a chance to run. Thus far, he'd had many close calls, but his training had seen him through each one. 5 times he'd watched, hidden, as his pursuers rode within feet of him, and twice he'd fought a pitched battle with enemy cavalry squads. Though outnumbered and exhausted, he'd left these men dead, their bodies and equipment buried, and their horses scattered. This is going to be a long one. For the past 3 days, he'd not seen or heard any sign of his pursuers, nor had he come across many local people. Those he did encounter paid him little attention. And his face and stature were similar to theirs. His instincts told him to ride on, that he hadn't put enough distance between himself and... From across the stream, perhaps 50 yards away, came the crack of a branch in the trees. Anyone else would have dismissed it, but Dockel knew the sound of a horse pushing through heavy brush. His own horse had stopped drinking, its head raised and ears twitching. From the trail, another sound, the scuff of a horse's hoof on the gravel trail. Dockel pulled the bow from the sheath on his back and an arrow from the quiver, then crouched down in the knee-high watergrass. Partially blocked by the horse's legs, Dockel peeked under the animal's belly, looking for signs of movement. There was nothing. He turned his head right. Through the trees, he could just make out the narrow trail. He watched, waited. Then another hoof scuff. Dockel knocked an arrow and drew the bow slightly, taking up the tension. A few moments later, a horse appeared on the trail, cantering slowly. The horse stopped. Dockel could see only the rider's legs and his black-gloved hands resting on the saddle's pommel, reins gripped loosely in his fingers. The hand moved, jerked the reins slightly. Beneath him, the horse whinnied and stamped its hoof. An intentional move, Dockel realized immediately, a distraction. The attackers would be coming from the forest side. Dockel drew the bow fully, took aim, and let fly the arrow. The point pierced the man's leg in the crease between his upper thigh and hip. He screamed, clutched his leg, and toppled off his horse. Instinctively, Dockel knew his aim was true. The arrow had punctured the leg artery. The man was out of the fight and would be dead within minutes. Still crouching, Dockel spun on his back heel while retrieving 3 more arrows from his quiver. 2 he planted in the ground before him, the 3rd he knocked. There, 30 feet away, were 3 attackers, swords drawn, creeping through the underbrush toward him. Dockel took aim on the trailing figure and fired. The man went down. In rapid succession, he fired twice more, catching one man squarely in the chest, the next in the throat. A 4th warrior let out a war cry and charged from behind a copse of trees. He almost reached the edge of the stream before Dockel's arrow dropped him. The forest fell silent. 4, Dockel thought? They had never sent fewer than a dozen before. As if in answer to his puzzlement, the pounding of horse hooves sounded on the trail behind him. Dockel spun, saw a line of horses galloping down the trail past their fallen comrade. 3 horses, 4, 7, 10 horses, and still they came. The odds were overwhelming. Dockel mounted his horse, knocked an arrow, and turned in his saddle in time to see the first horse galloping through the gap between the trees and into the clearing. Dockel fired. The arrow plunged into the man's right eye. Oh, shit. The force drove him backward, over his saddle, where he bumped off the rump of his horse and into the next rider, whose horse reared, backpedaling, creating a choke point. Horses began slamming into one another. The charge stalled. Dockel kicked his heels into his horse's flanks. The animal leapt off the bank into the water. Dockel brought its head around, heeled the horse, and charged downriver. He realized this was no chance ambush. His pursuers had been covertly following him for some time and had managed to surround him. Over the splashing of his horse's hooves in the shallow water, he could hear them now, riders crashing through the forest to his right and hooves on the gravel trail to his left. Ahead, the stream curved to the right. The trees and undergrowth were thicker here, crowding the bank, all but blotting out the sun and leaving him in twilight. He heard a shout and glanced over his shoulder. 4 riders were in pursuit. He looked right, saw dark horse shapes slipping in and out of the trees, paralleling his course. They were flushing him, he realized, but to where? His answer came seconds later as the trees suddenly parted, and he found himself in a meadow. The stream's width quadrupled. The color of the water told him the depth had increased as well. On impulse, he veered his horse left toward the sandy bank. Directly ahead, a line of 5 riders burst from the tree line. 2 of them bent low, pikes held horizontally before them, the other 3 riding upright, bows drawn. He laid his body across his horse's neck and jerked the reins to the right, back into the water. On the opposite bank, another line of riders had emerged from the trees, these too armed with pikes and bows. And to complete the ambush, directly behind, galloping down the stream toward him, was yet another line of cavalry. As if on cue, all 3 groups slowed to a trot, then stopped, pikes still at the ready and arrows nocked. They watched him. Why aren't they following, he wondered. And then he heard it, the deafening rush of water. Waterfall. I am caught, trapped. He reined back and let the horse walk until they reached a bend in the river. He stopped. Here the water was deeper and moving fast. 50 yards ahead, Dockel could see the mist plume billowing over the surface, could see the water boiling over the rocks at the rim of the cataract. He turned in his saddle. His pursuers had not moved save a single rider. The man's armor told Dockel this was the leader of the group. The man stopped 20 feet away and raised his hands to his shoulders, signaling he was unarmed. He shouted something. Dockel did not understand the language, but the tone was clear. Placation. It is over, the man was surely saying. You have fought well, done your duty. Surrender, and you will be treated fairly. It was a lie. He would be tortured and eventually killed. He would die fighting before he would let the Thurang fall into the hands of his accursed enemy. Dockel turned his horse until he was facing the pursuers. With exaggerated slowness, he drew the bow from his back and tossed it into the river. He did the same with his quiver, followed by his long sword and short sword. Finally, the dagger in his belt. The enemy leader gave Dockel a nod of respect, then turned in his saddle and shouted something to his men. Slowly, one by one, the riders raised their pikes and sheathed their bows. The leader turned back to Dockel and raised his hand, gesturing for him to come forward. Dockel gave him a smile and a shake of the head. He jerked his reins hard to the right, whipping his horse around, then heeled it hard in the flanks. The horse reared, coiled its legs beneath it, and began thrashing toward the spray rising above the deep waterfall. Yeah, I don't think you just did 10 milligrams of cocaine laced with acid. But hey, it's the internet. Anyone can be stupid here. Giuseppe saw the dust cloud on the eastern horizon before his brother did. A mile wide and confined by the walls of a narrow valley, the swirling brown wall of dirt and sand was headed directly for them. Eyes fixed on the spectacle, Giuseppe tapped his older brother on the shoulder. Francesco Lana de Terzi of Brescia, Lombardy, Italy, turned from his kneeling position where he'd been studying a sheaf of blueprints and looked in the direction Giuseppe was pointing. The younger Lana de Terzi whispered nervously, "Is it a storm?" "Of sorts," Francesco replied, "but not the kind you mean." Behind that dust cloud was not another wind-whipped sandstorm, the kind they'd grown so accustomed to over the last 6 months, but rather hundreds of pounding horses' hooves, and atop the horses, hundreds of elite and deadly soldiers. Francesco gave Giuseppe a reassuring clap on the shoulder. "Do not worry, brother. I have been expecting them, though, I admit, not this early." "It is him?" Giuseppe croaked. "He is coming? You did not tell me that." "I didn't want to frighten you. Worry not. We still have time." Francesco raised a flattened hand to shield his eyes from the sun and studied the approaching cloud. Distances were deceptive here, he had learned. The vastness of the Qing Empire lay far beyond the horizon. In the 2 years they'd spent in this country, Francesco and his brother had seen a wild variety of terrain, from jungles to forests to deserts. But of all of them, this place, this territory that seemed to have a dozen different pronunciations and spellings, was the most God-forsaken. Composed mostly of hills, some rolling and some jagged, the land was a vast canvas painted in only 2 colors, brown and gray. It was good it makes you want to read, Martini. I don't know what that is, though. I don't know what Symphony of Ages is. It was as though God had cursed this place with a swipe of his mighty hand. On days when the clouds parted, the startlingly blue sky seemed only to accent the ashen landscape. And then there was the wind, Francesco thought with a shudder. The seemingly endless wind that whistled through the rocks and drove eddies of dust along the ground, and that seemed so animated the locals often treated the phenomena like ghosts come to snatch away their souls. I'm going to drink. That wasn't a very good one. "6 months ago, Francesco, a scientist by nature and training, had scoffed at such superstitions. Now he wasn't so sure. He had heard too many strange sounds in the night. Another few days, he consoled himself, and we will have the resources we need. But it wasn't simply a matter of time, was it? He was making a bargain with the devil. The fact that he was doing it for the larger good was something he hoped God would remember when Judgment Day came. He studied the approaching wall of dust a few seconds more before lowering his hand and turning to Giuseppe. "They are still 20 miles away," he estimated. "We have another hour at least. Come, let us finish." Francesco turned back around and shouted to one of the men, a squat, powerful figure in a roughly woven black tunic and trousers. Hal, Francesco's primary liaison and translator, jogged over. "Yes, sire," he said in a heavily accented but passable Italian. Yeah, I'm not going to do accents yet. I'll work myself up to it someday, I promise. Francesco sighed. Though he'd long ago given up trying to get Hal to call him by his first name, he had hoped that at least by now the man would have ceased with the formality. "Tell the men to finish quickly. Our guest will be arriving soon." Hal cast an eye to the horizon and saw what Giuseppe had pointed out a few minutes earlier. His eyes widened. He nodded curtly, said, "It will be done, sire," then turned around and began barking orders to the dozens of local men milling around the hilltop clearing. He scurried off to join. Friedrich is not reading any books on this channel. The clearing, which measured 100 paces square, was in fact the roof of Agampa's interior courtyard. On all sides of the clearing, its turreted walls and watchtowers followed the hill's ridges down to the valley floor like spines on a lizard's back. You guys are moderating the shit out of things right now, aren't you? While Francesco had been told a Gompa was primarily a fortified center for education, the residents of this particular stronghold seemed to practice only one profession, soldiering. And for that, he was grateful. We're not doing Friedrich. As evidenced by the frequent raids and skirmishes that took place on the plains below, it was clear he and his men were living on this realm's frontier. It was no accident that they had been transported here to complete work on the machine, which their benefactor had dubbed the Great Dragon. The clearing now echoed with the overlapping pounding of mallets on wood as house workers hurried to drive the final stakes into the rocky soil. All across the clearing, plumes of brown dust rose into the air, only to be caught by the wind and whipped into nothingness. After another 10 minutes, the mallets fell silent. Hal scrambled back to where Francesco and Giuseppe stood. "We are done, sir." Francesco backed up a few steps and admired the structure. He was pleased. Designing it on paper was one thing. To see it come to life was something else altogether. Standing 40 feet tall, occupying 3/4 of the clearing, constructed of snow-white silk with curved exterior bamboo braces painted blood red, the tent seemed like a castle built of clouds. "Well done," Francesco told Hal. "Giuseppe?" "Magnificent," the younger Lana de Terzi murmured. Francesco nodded and said softly, "Now, let us hope what is inside is even more impressive." Though the Gompa's hawk-eyed lookouts had certainly spotted the visitors approaching even before Giuseppe had, the alert horns did not sound until the retinue was but minutes away. This, as well as the rider's direction of approach and early arrival, was a tactical decision, Francesco guessed. Most of the enemy's outposts lay to the west. By coming in from the east, the party's dust cloud would be obscured by the hill on which the Gompa sat. This way, roving ambush parties would have no time to intercept the new arrivals. Knowing their benefactor as he did, Francesco suspected they had been covertly watching the Gompa from a distance, waiting for the wind direction to change and enemy patrols to move on. A cunning man, their patron, Francesco reminded himself. Cunning and dangerous. Less than 10 minutes later, Francesco heard the crunching of leather and armored boots on the spiral gravel path below the clearing. Swirling dust rose above the rock-lined border of the clearing. Then, suddenly, silence. Though Francesco was expecting it, what came next startled him all the same. With a single barked command from an unseen mouth, a cadre of 24 home guard soldiers double-timed into the clearing. Each syncopated footstep punctuated. Very different words. Punctuated by a rhythmic grunt. Grim-faced, eyes fixed on the horizon, their pikes held horizontally before them, the guards spread out through the clearing and began herding the awestruck workers to its far side and out of sight behind the tent. I think I am actually getting used to the Jameson, though, which makes me sad. Once done, they took up stations along the clearing's perimeter, spaced at regular intervals, facing outward, pikes held diagonally across their bodies. Again, from the path below, another guttural command, followed by armored sandals crunching on gravel. A diamond-shaped formation of royal bodyguards in red and black bamboo armor marched into the clearing and headed directly toward where Francesco and Giuseppe stood. The phalanx stopped suddenly, and the soldiers' foresides stepped to the left and right, opening a human gate through which a single man strode. Standing 3 handwidths taller than his tallest soldiers, the Kangxi Emperor, the ruler of the Qing dynasty, the regent of the Mandate of Heaven, wore an expression that made the grimness of his soldiers' faces seem positively exuberant. The Kangxi Emperor took 3 long strides toward Francesco and came to a stop. Through squinted eyes, he studied the Italian's face for several seconds before speaking. Francesco was about to call for Hal to translate, but the man was already there, standing at his elbow and whispering in his ear. "The Emperor says, Are you surprised to see me? Surprised, yes, but pleased nonetheless, Your Majesty. The question was not a casual inquiry, Francesco knew. The Kangxi Emperor was paranoid in the extreme. Had Francesco not seemed sufficiently surprised at the Emperor's early arrival, he would have fallen under immediate suspicion of being a spy. What is this structure I see before me? The Kangxi Emperor asked. God damn it. It is a tent, Your Majesty, of my own design. It serves not only to protect the green dragon, but also to shield it from prying eyes. The Kangxi Emperor nodded curtly. You will provide the plans to my personal secretary. With a raised fingertip, he commanded the secretary to step forward. Francesco said, Of course, Your Majesty. The slaves I have provided you have performed adequately? You hold your tongue, Cassie. Everything is fine. Francesco winced inwardly at the Emperor's question, but said nothing. Over the past 6 months, he and Giuseppe had worked and lived with these men under hardship conditions. They were friends now. He did not confess this aloud, however. Such an emotional attachment would be a lever if the Emperor would not hesitate to use. This is not because of this, Cassie. They have performed admirably, Your Majesty. Sadly, though, 4 of them died last week when... That is the way of the world, death. If they died in service to their emperor, their ancestors will greet them with pride. My foreman and translator, Hao, has been inescapably valuable. That is not at all the word. All right, maybe you're right, Cassie. I don't know. I feel okay, but now words are starting to look different. Super fun. My foreman and translator, Hao, has been especially invaluable. Very different. The Kangxi Emperor flicked his eyes at Hao, then back to Francesco. The man's family will be released from prison. I really have to decide on a voice for this dude. The Emperor raised his finger above his shoulder. A personal secretary made a notation on the parchment he cradled in his arms. Francesco took a deep, calming breath and smiled. Thank you, Your Majesty, for your kindness. Tell me, when will the great dragon be ready? Another 2 days will you have until dawn tomorrow. With that, the Kangxi Emperor turned on his heel and strode back into the phalanx, which closed in behind him, did a synchronized about-face, and marched from the clearing, followed moments later by the home guard soldiers from around the perimeter. Once the clomp of footsteps and the rhythmic grunting faded away, Giuseppe said, Is he crazy? Tomorrow at dawn, how can we... We will make it, Francesco replied, with time to spare. How? We have only a few more hours of work left. I told the Emperor 2 days, knowing he would demand the seemingly impossible. This way, we can give it to him. Giuseppe smiled. You are a crafty one, brother. Well done. Come, let us put the finishing touches on this great dragon. Under the glow of pole-mounted torches and the watchful gaze of the Emperor's personal secretary, who stood just inside the tent's entrance, arms folded inside his tunic, they worked through the night with Hao, their ever-reliable foreman, playing his part perfectly, haranguing the men to hurry, hurry, hurry. Francesco and Giuseppe did their part as well, walking through the tent, asking questions, bending down here and there to inspect this or that. Ox sinew guidelines were unlashed, reknotted, then checked for tension. Bamboo stays and cross braces were sounded with mallets to search for cracks. Silk was closely examined for the slightest imperfections. The rattan... let's go with rattan-woven undercarriage underwent a mock attack with sharpened sticks to gauge its battle readiness. Finding it lacking, Francesco ordered another coat of black lacquer to be applied to the walls and bulwarks. And finally, the artist Giuseppe had hired finished the bow mural. A dragon's snout, complete with bearded eyes, bared fangs, and a protruding forked tongue. God damn it. As the sun's upper rim rose above the hills to the east, Francesco ordered that all work be quickly finished. Once this was done, he slowly circled the machine from bow to stern. Hands on his hips, head tilting this way and that, Francesco studied the ship's every surface, its every feature, looking for the slightest flaw. He found none. He returned to the bow and gave the Emperor's personal secretary a firm nod. Rattan? Rattan? It's like that woven patio furniture they loved in the 70s. You mean wicker? I'm going to assume you mean wicker. I've never heard rattan before, but that's a fine pronunciation. I'll go with it. He returned to the bow and gave the Emperor's personal secretary a firm nod. The man ducked under the tent flap and disappeared. Well, if it's very similar to wicker, just say wicker. Why do I have to write that? An hour later came the now familiar clomping and grunting of the Emperor's retinue. The sound seemed to fill the clearing before suddenly falling silent. Now dressed in a simple gray silk tunic, the Kangxi Emperor stepped through the tent's entrance, followed by his personal secretary and his chief bodyguard. The Emperor stopped in his tracks, eyes wide. In the 2 years he had known the Emperor, this was the first time Francesco had seen the potentate? Potentate? I'll drink for it, but I don't actually think I've heard that word before. Potentate. Potentate? We're going to go with potentate. Because I'm American. That's what we do. This was the first time Francesco had seen the potentate, taken aback. With the sun's pinkish-orange light streaming through the tent's white silken walls and roof, the interior was bathed in an otherworldly glow. All right. The Jameson may actually be affecting me a little bit, Cassie, because I just wanted to say roof. I wanted to say roof. That's not a good sign. The normally earthen floor had been covered in jet black rugs that left the attendees feeling as though they were standing at the edge of an abyss. Scientist though he was, Francesco Lana de Terzi had a bit of showman in him. The Kangxi Emperor stepped forward, unconsciously hesitating as his foot touched the edge of the black rug, then strode to the bow, where he gazed at the dragon's face. It's fascinating. Completely useless. Now he smiled. This was another first for Francesco. He'd never seen the Emperor without his characteristic dour expression. Expression. Shut up. The Emperor spun to face Francesco. I'm just going to hold this from now on. "It is magnificent," came Hao's translation. "Unleash her." Shh. Cassie, I'm trying to do something right now, okay? Just, Andrew's working, okay? "At your command, Majesty." Once outside, Francesco's men took their stations around the tent. At his command, the tent's skylines were cut. Weighted along with their upper hems as Francesco had designed them, the silken walls collapsed straight down. Simultaneously, on the rear side of the tent, a dozen men heaved the tent's roof. Now I actually did it. Roof. I have never pronounced roof as roof in my life, and yet somehow tonight it's coming out. On the rear side of the tent, a dozen men heaved the tent's roof backward, which rose up and billowed open like a great sail before being hauled down and out of sight. All was silent, save the wind whipping through the Gompa's turreted walls and windows. Standing alone in the center of the clearing was the Kangxi Emperor's flying machine, the Great Dragon. Francesco cared nothing for this moniker. While he of course humored his benefactor, to Francesco, the scientist, the machine... Okay, come on, that's a typo. To Francesco the scientist, the machine was merely a prototype for his dream, a true lighter-than-air vacuum ship. I'm correcting it, because that... whatever. Oh my god. Interesting. So, I feel like we'd be okay in not talking about toothbrushes or whatever that guy's on about. Or girl. Could be a girl. It's 2018, it's almost 2019, I shouldn't assume. All was silent save the wind whipping through the Gompa's turreted walls and windows. Standing alone in the center was a... oh, I went way too far back. To Francesco the scientist, the machine was merely a prototype for his dream, a true lighter-than-air vacuum ship. Measuring 50 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 30 feet tall, the ship's upper structure was composed of 4 spheres of thick silk contained inside cages of finger-thin bamboo braces and animal sinew. Running from bow to stern, each sphere measured 12 feet in diameter and was equipped with a valve port in its belly. Each of these ports was connected to a vertical copper stovepipe and girdled in its own lattice of bamboo and sinew. From the valve port, the stovepipe descended 4 feet to a thin bamboo plank, to whose bottom was affixed a wind-shielded charcoal brazier. And finally, affixed by sinew to the spheres, above was the black lacquered rattan gondola, long enough to accommodate 10 soldiers in a line, along with supplies, equipment, and weapons, as well as a pilot and navigator. The Kangxi Emperor strode forward alone until he was standing beneath the 4th sphere, facing the dragon's mouth. He raised his hands above his head as though he were beholding, Francesco thought, his own creation. It was at this moment that the gravity of what he'd done hit him. A wave of sadness and shame washed over him. Truly, he had made a pact with the devil. This man, this cruel monarch, was going to use his great dragon to murder other human beings, soldiers and civilians alike. Armed with... Alright, other languages don't count. Armed with Hu Yao, or gunpowder, a substance that Europe was only now using with moderate success, and which China had long ago mastered, the Kangxi Emperor would be able to rain fire down upon his enemies, using matchlock muskets, bombs, and fire-spitting devices. He could do all of this while out of reach in the sky, and moving faster than the swiftest horse. The truth had come too late, Francesco realized. The death machine was in the Kangxi Emperor's hands now. There was no changing that. Perhaps if he were able to make a success of his true vacuum ship, Francesco could balance out the evil to come. Of course, he would know that only on Judgment Day. Francesco was shaken from his reverie as he realized the Kangxi Emperor was standing before him. "I am pleased," the Emperor informed him. "Once you have shown my generals how to build more of these, you will have all you require to pursue your own venture. Majesty. Is it ready to fly? Give the command and it will be done. It is given, but first, a change. As planned, Master Lana de Terzi, you will pilot the great dragon on her test flight. Your brother will remain here with us." "Pardon me, Majesty, why?" "Why, to ensure your return, of course, and to save you when you are tempted to hand over the great dragon to my enemies." "Majesty, I would not, and now we will be certain you will not." "Master, Giuseppe is my co-pilot and navigator. I need him. I have eyes and ears everywhere, Master Lana de Terzi. Your vaunted foreman, Hao, is as well trained as your brother. Hao will accompany you along with 6 of my home guards should you need assistance." "I must protest, Majesty." "You must not, Master Lana de Terzi," the Kangxi Emperor replied coldly. The warning was clear. Francesco took a calming breath. "Where will you have me go on this test flight?" "Do you see the mountains to the south, the great ones touching the heavens?" "I do." "You will travel there." "Your Majesty, that That is enemy territory. What better test of a war? Francesco opened his mouth to protest, but the Kangxi emperor continued. In the foothills along the streams you will find a golden flower. Hao knows the one I mean. Bring that flower back to me before it wilts, and you will be rewarded. Your Majesty, those mountains are 40 miles away, Francesco thought. Perhaps 50. Too far for a maiden voyage. Perhaps you will bring the flower back to me before it wilts, or I will mount your brother's head on a spike. Do you understand? I understand. Francesco turned to his younger brother. Having heard the entire exchange, Giuseppe's face had gone ashen. His chin trembled. Brother, I'm scared. No need. I'll be back before you know it. Shut up, Cassie. I don't want to hear it right now. Giuseppe took a breath, set his jaw, and squared his shoulders. Yes, I know you're right. The craft is a wonder, and there is no one better at piloting it. With luck, we'll be sharing dinner together tonight. Good spirit, Francesco said. They embraced for several seconds before Francesco pulled away. He turned to face Hao and said, Order the braziers stoked. We lift off in 10 minutes. Ooh. Shall I keep going? Because I was going to go target maybe an hour. We're going in on 50 minutes. It's a few pages for the next section. I'm okay with it. You think so? Well, if Cassie thinks so, she's the reason that I'm doing half of this, so at least this part. And Chica Chats. All right. Here we go. Sam Fargo eased back on the throttle, taking the engine to idle. You did spice it up, Cassie. That's absolutely true. The speedboat slowed, gliding to a stop in the water. He shut off the engines, and the craft began rocking gently from side to side. A quarter mile off the bow, their destination rose from the water, a thickly forested island whose interior was dominated by sharp peaks, plummeting valleys, and thick rainforest. Below these, a shoreline pockmarked with hundreds of pocket coves and narrow inlets. In the speedboat's aft seat, Remy Fargo looked up from her book, a little escapist reading entitled The Aztec Codices, An Oral History of Conquest and Genocide, pushed her sunglasses onto her forehead, and gazed at her husband. Trouble? He turned to her and gave her an admiring stare. Just enjoying the scenic view. Then Sam gave an exaggerated wiggle of his eyebrows. I look like I came out of a shift at a catering hall because it is respectful to you, the audience. I dress like, I actually have respect for you. And not that I don't give a shit. Actually, I don't know. I just thought it would be funny. But whatever. Remy smiled. A smooth talker. She closed the book and placed it on the seat beside her. But Magnum P.I., you are not. Sam nodded at the book. How is it? Slow reading, but the Aztecs were fascinating people. More than anyone ever imagined. How long until you're finished with that one? It's next on my reading list. Tomorrow or the next day. As of late, each of them had been saddled with a daunting amount of homework, and the island to which they were headed was largely the cause. In any other circumstances, the speck of land between Sumatra and Java might be a tropical getaway, but it had in the last few months been turned into a dig site crawling with archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and of course a plethora of Indonesian government officials. Like all of them, each time Sam and Remy visited the island, they had to negotiate the treehouse-like rope city the engineers had strung above the site, lest the ground collapse below the feet of the people trying to preserve the find. What Sam and Remy had discovered on Pulau Legundi was helping to rewrite Aztec and U.S. Civil War history, and as the directors of not only this project but also 2 others, they had to stay current on the mountain of data coming in. And that sounds like the roommate. Let's see if we can get him on camera. Wait for it. That's a key. I'm not sure what he's doing. Wait for it. Hey, Isaac. And he's gone. Isaac, you should come out and say hi. Isaac. Isaac. I know you're listening. He's ignoring us. Someday we're going to get him to come out. I promise. I've been trying to convince him to come out and just sit over there with popcorn and enjoy the broadcast and be part of it at the same time. But thus far I have obviously not succeeded in convincing him. But someday, he will become part of the broadcast. It was for them a labor of love. While their passion was treasure hunting, a decidedly hands-on, field-intensive avocation based as much on instinct as it was on research, each of them had come to it from a scientific background. Sam, a Caltech-educated engineer, Remy, an anthropology and history major from Boston College. Woo, Boston College. Sam had fallen fairly close to the familial tree. His father, now passed away, had been one of the lead engineers on NASA's space programs, while his mother, Eunice, now 71, lived in Key West, the sole proprietor, captain, and chief bottle washer of a snorkeling and deep-sea fishing boat. Is bottle washer like a an important thing for deep-sea fishing? I don't know. Remy's mother and father, a custom home builder and pediatrician/author respectively, were both retired and living the good life in Maine, raising llamas. Of course. Because who doesn't want to raise the llama when they get old? Sam and Remy had met in Hermosa Beach at a jazz bar called the Lighthouse. On a whim, Sam had stopped in for a cold beer, and he found Remy and some colleagues letting off steam after spending the past few weeks hunting for a sunken galleon off Abalone Cove. Neither of them were starry-eyed enough to remember their first meeting as instant love, but the spark was undeniable. Talking and laughing over drinks, they closed down the lighthouse without noticing the hours slipping by. 6 months later, they were married there in a small ceremony. With Remy's encouragement, Sam had been pursuing an idea he'd been tinkering with, an argon laser scanner designed to detect and identify alloys at a distance, through soil and water alike. Treasure hunters, universities, corporations, mining outfits, and the Department of Defense came begging for licenses, checkbooks open, and with a couple of years, Fargo Group Limited was turning a 7-figure profit. 4 years later, they accepted a buyout offer that left them undeniably wealthy, set for the rest of their lives. Instead of sitting back, however, they took a month-long vacation, then established the Fargo Foundation, and set out on their first joint treasure hunt. The wealth recovered went to a long list of charities. Now the Fargos started in silence. Now the Fargos stared in silence at the island before them. Remy murmured, "Still a little hard to fathom, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," Sam agreed. Fascinating. We have spammers already. I feel like that's an achievement. Getting spammers in the channel is an achievement of sorts. It's not a great achievement, but it is an achievement. Not a great achievement, just an achievement. No amount of education or experience could have prepared them for what they'd found on Pulau Lugandi. The chance discovery of a ship's bell off Zanzibar had mushroomed into discoveries that would occupy the attention of generations of archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists. Sam was shaken from his reverie by the double whoop. That's probably the same word, right? The double whoop. We'll go with whoop. That sounds better. The double whoop of a marine horn. He turned to port. Half a mile away, a 36-foot Sumatran harbor patrol boat was headed directly for them. "Sam, did you forget to pay for gas back at the rental place?" Remy asked wryly. "No. Used the counterfeit rupiah I had lying around." "That might be it." They watched as the boat closed the gap to a quarter mile, where it turned first to starboard, then to port in a crescent turn that brought it alongside them 100 feet away. Over a loudspeaker, an Indonesian accented voice said in English, "Ahoy! Are you Sam and Remy Fargo?" Sam raised his arm in the affirmative. "Stand by, please. We have a passenger for you." Sam and Remy exchanged puzzled glances. They were expecting no one. The harbor boat circled them once, closing the distance until they were 3 feet off the port beam. The engine slowed to idle, then went silent. "At least they look friendly," Sam muttered to his wife. The last time they had been approached by a foreign naval vessel had been in Zanzibar. There it had been a patrol boat equipped with 12.7 millimeter cannons and crewed by angry-looking sailors bearing AK-47s. "So far," Remy replied. On the boat's afterdeck, standing between two blue uniformed police officers, was a petite Asian woman in her mid-40s with a lean, angular face and a hairdo that bordered on being a crew cut. All right, that's it for the drink. So now we open this thing up and go straight to the source. "Permission to come aboard?" the woman asked. And yes, that was an accent, Cassie. I don't want to hear it. Sam shrugged. "Permission granted." The two policemen stepped forward as though preparing to help her cross the gap, but she ignored them, taking a single fluid stride that vaulted her off the gunwale and onto the Fargo's afterdeck. Cassie. She landed softly, cat-like. She turned to face Sam and Remy, who was now standing at her husband's side. The woman stared at them a moment with a pair of impassive black eyes, then handed them a business card. It said simply, "Zeelan Chu." "What can we do for you, Miss Hugh?" Hugh? It's HSU. I don't actually know how to pronounce that, asked Remy. "My employer, Charles King, requests the pleasure of your company." Our apologies, but we're not familiar with Mr. King. He is waiting for you aboard his private aircraft at the private charter terminal outside Palembang. He wishes to speak with you." While Zeelan Chu's English was technically flawless, there was a disconcerting stiffness to it. Oh, she shouldn't have an accent. I apologize. It was technically flawless. There was a disconcerting stiffness to it, as though she were in automation. I'll do it like a computer moving forward. "That part we understand," Sam said. He handed the card back to her. "Who is Charles King, and why does he want to see us?" "Mr. King has authorized me to..." That is ridiculous. "Mr. King has authorized me to tell you it concerns an acquaintance of yours, Mr. Frank Alton." This got Sam and Remy's attention. Alton was not just an acquaintance, but rather a close, longtime friend, a former San Diego police officer turned private detective. Sam had met in judo class. That was one sentence, not many. God damn it. Oh, we're just gonna... Oh. No. Every time I think I'm getting used to the Jameson, I found out I'm very wrong. A former San Diego police officer turned private detective Sam had met in judo class. Sam, Remy, Frank, and his wife Judy had a standing monthly dinner date. "What about him?" Sam asked. "Mr. King wishes to speak to you directly regarding Mr. Alton." "You're being very secretive, Miss Hugh," Remy said. "Care to tell us why?" "Mr. King wishes to speak with us directly," Remy finished. Yes, that is right. Sam checked his watch. Please tell Mr. King we will meet him at 7 o'clock. That is 4 hours from now, said Zillan. Mr. King is going to have to wait, Sam finished. We have business we need to attend to. Zillan Su's stoic expression flashed to anger, but the look was gone almost as soon as it appeared. She simply nodded and said, 7 o'clock. Please be on time. Without another word, she turned and leapt gazelle-like off the deck to the harbor patrol boat's gunwale. She pushed past the policeman and disappeared into the cabin. One of the policemen tipped his cap to them. 10 seconds later, the engines growled to life, and the boat pulled away. Well, that was interesting, Sam said a few seconds later. She's a real charmer, Remy said. Did you catch her choice of words? Sam nodded. Mr. King has authorized. If she understands the connotation, then we can assume Mr. King is going to be just as genial. Do you believe her about Frank? Judy would have called us if anything had happened. While their adventures often led them into dicey situations, their daily lives were fairly calm. Still, Zillan Chu's unexpected visit and mysterious invitation had both their internal warning alarms going off. As unlikely as it seemed, the possibility of a trap was something they couldn't ignore. Let's find out, Sam said. He knelt down by the driver's seat, retrieved his backpack from under the dashboard, and pulled out his satellite phone from one of the side pockets. He dialed, and a few seconds later, a female voice said, Yes, Mr. Fargo? Oh, fuck me. For the record, this is the worst way to make a James and Ginger. I don't recommend it. Thought this was going to be the lucky call, Sam said. He had a running bet with Remy that someday he'd catch Selma Wandrash off guard and she'd call either of them by their first name. God damn it. Not today, Mr. Fargo. Their chief researcher, logistical guru, and keeper of the inner sanctum, Selma, was a former Hungarian citizen who, despite having lived in the United States for decades, still retained a trace of an accent, enough that it gave her voice a slight Zaza Gabor lilt. I actually don't know how to do that accent, so I'm going to leave it go. Selma had managed the Library of Congress's Special Collections Division until Sam and Remy lured her away with the promise of carte blanche and state-of-the-art resources. Aside from her hobby aquarium and a collection of tea that occupied an entire cabinet in the workroom, Selma's only passion was research. She was at her happiest when the Fargos gave her an ancient riddle to unravel. Someday you'll call me Sam. Not today. What time is it there? About 11. Selma rarely went to bed before midnight and rarely slept past 4 or 5 in the morning. Despite this, she never sounded anything less than wide awake. What have you got for me? A dead end, we're hoping, Sam replied, then recounted their visit from Zillan Chu. Charles King comes off like the anointed one. I have heard of him. He's rich with a capital R. See if you can dig up any dirt about his personal life. Anything else? Have you heard any news from the Altons? No, nothing, replied Selma. Call Judy and see if Frank's out of the country, Sam requested. Look into it discreetly. If there is a problem, we don't want to alarm Judy. When do you meet King? Selma asked. In 4 hours. Got it, Selma said with a laugh in her voice. By then, I'll know his shirt size and his favorite flavor of ice cream. I'm going to call it at that. All right. So, I have been reading from a book called The Kingdom by Clive Cussler. Now, Clive Cussler is actually one of my favorite fiction artists. Oh, look, there's a picture of him on the back. Kind of looks like... Honestly, he kind of looks like the Colonel from KFC a little bit. I mean, yeah, a little bit, right? But whatever, he has all these, like, mystery books and stuff, and he has them in series. So he has, like, a series for this guy named Dirk Pitt, and then there's another one, the Numa Chronicles or something. I can never remember what the guy is called. But so the first book I ever read of his was called The Serpent, and I'm probably going to read it again someday because it really was it's like a favorite book of mine. But I read it because my dad dropped me off at an airport, and he just kind of bought the book for me, and he's like, "Here, I like these books. You can read this while you're on the flight alone." And that was how I got sent off by my father for my first ever flight without supervision. Yeah, I read the book in the flight, which kind of matches. So I actually hadn't finished reading this until today. I think it's like a 453-page book, and I finished it. I was at maybe 190 today when I woke up after driving home from Pennsylvania, and I finished it by like 8 o'clock, 8:30. So it only took me a few hours. But it was a good book. It was a great book. Again, The Kingdom by Clive Cussler. There's a whole series of these books with Sam and Remy Fargo, a Fargo adventure. Yeah, look at that. Yeah. If you enjoy kind of adventure mystery books or anything along those lines, you might find that you enjoy pretty much everything that Clive Cussler writes. Oftentimes he writes with other people, so I should say this is Clive Cussler with Grant Blackwood. But I will make sure that I put up the link when I post this to YouTube. And thanks for joining me tonight. I hope you guys like the longer format, because I'm probably going to do that moving forward. I actually think I like it a lot more. So we're probably going to go with that. But anyway, have a good night, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.